All right, so you've given us quite a bit to unpack here, huh? Death and mortality, big topic. We've got excerpts from this Book of Death, along with your questionnaire. It seems like you're really diving deep on this one.
Definitely a subject that gets you thinking. And you're going beyond just the surface level, looking at the societal and personal impacts, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, and the Book of Death doesn't mess around, that's for sure. Right away, it contrasts these two stories of children dying, Amina in a Ghanaian village, and then Sarah's experience in a much wealthier country.
And that contrast really highlights just how much socioeconomic factors come into play, even going back centuries. Amina's daughter dies from a fever. I mean, today we'd probably think that's treatable, but back then it was a huge risk for kids. Sarah's daughter, Lola, she has a fever too, but because they have access to better health care, it's a totally different outcome.
Makes you think about how far we've come, but also how unequal those advancements have been. The book actually argues that for a long time, child mortality wasn't just this tragic thing, it was almost expected. Could you imagine living with that all the time?
It's tough to wrap your head around from where we are now with all the medical technology we have. Like the book talks about Jason, who dies from syphilis, really shows how the choices you make even early in life can have these lasting impacts, sometimes fatal ones.
It's a reminder that some things we take for granted now as being treatable, they were a much bigger deal back then. And then the book kind of shifts gears to these large-scale accidents, the ones that make the news, shipwrecks like the Danya Paz in the Philippines, the Titanic, even plane crashes.
And those events, as awful as they are, often force these changes that have a much wider impact. Like after the Titanic, maritime safety laws had to be completely rewritten. It makes you wonder how many things we consider basic safety measures today came about because of some disaster in the past.
Sobering thought for sure. But it's not just accidents either, right? The Book of Death gets into violence, and it gets pretty intense. Talking about homicide, domestic abuse. They even mention that, every single day, an estimated 137 women are killed by a family member.
Yeah, those numbers really hit home, Behind each statistic, there's an actual person, a family, a whole community impacted by that loss. And then there's the kind of violence that leaves its mark on entire nations, like the Rwandan genocide.
Hundreds of thousands of people killed in just a few months. It's almost impossible to grasp that scale of loss. And the book talks about how events like that, even decades later, they continue to affect everything, from how a country sees itself to how its society functions.
Absolutely. These huge acts of violence leave these deep scars that can last for generations, really forces us to confront the worst parts of humanity and the truly devastating consequences when hatred and prejudice take hold. And speaking of tough subjects, the book also tackles suicide head-on. It's a leading cause of death, and they talk about mental health's role, but they also touch on those more controversial aspects like assisted suicide.
And that's where it starts to get really interesting, I think. They even imagine this future where voluntary death is like a normal thing. They talk about these death cabins. Feels very dystopian, doesn't it?
It does, and it brings up all these ethical questions about choice, about what it even means to value life when death is just an option you can pick whenever. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, maybe we should look at how the Book of Death approaches the underlying causes of death. It's not just about how, but why. Exactly. And the Book of Death really digs into how things like poverty, not having decent health care, and just the feeling of hopelessness that comes with that, all of that can really affect how long someone lives.
It's like this cycle that's hard to escape. The book gives these really stark examples, malnutrition, no clean water, diseases that could be easily treated if people had access to even basic medical care. And then there's the story of Henrietta Lacks, the woman whose cancer cells were taken without her knowledge or consent.
Oh, right, Henrietta Lacks. That's a fascinating and honestly heartbreaking story.
Totally. On the one hand, her cells, the HeLa cells, they're called, they've been crucial for all sorts of medical breakthroughs. But the fact that no one even asked her, that a Black woman in that time had no say, it adds another layer to this whole conversation about who benefits from healthcare and whose bodies are used for scientific progress.
Absolutely. Henrietta's case is like a textbook example of why informed consent is so important and why treating all patients with respect is crucial, especially people from marginalized communities. And speaking of things that impact how long we live, the book then goes into something you might not expect. Loneliness.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting to me. I mean, we all know connecting with others is good for you mentally, but the book claims that loneliness can actually increase your risk of dying sooner.
That's right. It's not just about feeling lonely, but the physical effects of being isolated from others for long periods of time. The book cites studies saying it can be as bad for you as smoking or being obese. It leads to stress, high blood pressure, even a weakened immune system.
Great.
Crazy, right?
It kind of makes you see those public service announcements in a whole new light. It's not just about being nice and reaching out. It's like literally about recognizing that those connections affect our health. And then the Book of Death goes back to the medical field, but this time it's all about medical mistakes and things going wrong.
Yeah, and it goes way beyond just modern malpractice. They bring up the horrific stuff done by Nazi doctors during the Holocaust, like a chilling reminder of what happens when ethics are completely ignored in the name of science. It's disturbing. They talk about Joseph Mengele, the doctor who did those awful experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz. Hard to even read about, but it shows how easily the pursuit of knowledge, especially when someone has unchecked power, can become seriously messed up.
It makes you think about those in power and what they choose to do with it. A dark part of history, for sure.
Yeah. Anyway, the book does transition to more present-day concerns.
Yeah.
Things like preventable medical errors, surgical complications, basically acknowledging that even routine medical procedures have some risk. It's not foolproof.
Right. Even with all the advancements we have, healthcare is still run by humans, so, mistakes happen. But and I think this is a good point the book makes. It's not about scaring people. It's more about emphasizing the importance of things like informed consent, asking questions, and advocating for yourself in medical situations. You have a voice. Use it. Totally. Be informed and be your own advocate. So we've covered a lot of different ways to die, the reasons behind them. But the Book of Death isn't just about doom and gloom, right? It also gets into how different cultures throughout history have dealt with death and dying.
Yeah, and this is where your questionnaire overlaps with some of the stuff in the book. You were asking about the role of rituals, right?
It was, and it's perfect timing because the book takes us on this whole journey through different cultural practices. You've got ancestor worship in some Asian traditions, these big celebrations of life common in a lot of African cultures. Just fascinating to see the different approaches.
Exactly. And while the specifics might be different, all of these rituals, whether it's elaborate funerals, mourning periods, building shrines, whatever it is, they're all trying to do something similar. Helping the living cope with loss, showing respect for the dead, and finding a way to move on. It's a human thing.
And it's not just those cultural practices either. The book looks at how different religions view death, too. It's kind of cool how these belief systems can offer people comfort, a sense of meaning, a reason to have hope, all these different ways of dealing with something that's ultimately a mystery.
It's like, it's not just about what happens to our bodies, but what happens to that digital footprint we leave behind.
It really makes you think about what it means to live on after you're gone. I mean, does your Instagram feed become your legacy in a way? Strange to think about.
It is. And the Book of Death even touches on some of the legal and to decide what happens to your online stuff after you die. Is it like your possessions, something you can pass down?
I mean, there are services now that manage your digital afterlife for you. So it's something people are already thinking about. But then the Book of Death goes even further, talking about artificial intelligence and transhumanism. It's like we've explored all these ways to die, all the meaning we attach to it, and then technology throws us a curveball. What if we could cheat death altogether?
Right. And they're not just talking about living longer. They're talking about uploading your consciousness, becoming some kind of immortal AI. Feels very Black Mirror, huh?
Seriously.
Yeah.
It's like, is that even really living anymore? I can see why you had that question about fear in your questionnaire. Facing the possibility of no longer being limited by death, that's a whole other level of existential crisis.
For sure. And the Book of Death, as much as it's about death, it really does make you think about what it means to be alive, doesn't it?
It does. It's like, if death wasn't the end, how would that change how you live your life? Would you even be the same person? It's getting deep now.
It is. But maybe that's the point. Maybe thinking about death, even in these kind of abstract ways, can actually help us appreciate being alive even more.
Okay, so let's come back to your questionnaire for a minute. You were asking about your own mortality, about what kind of legacy you want to leave behind. It seems like you've been wrestling with some big questions.
And those questions about fear, about purpose, about how you'll be remembered, they're all right there in the Book of Death, too. It's a process a lot of us go through, trying to make sense of our own mortality, trying to find meaning when faced with the unknown.
It can be a pretty overwhelming process, for sure. But like the Book of Death reminds us, confronting that fear, that uncertainty, it can actually be a really positive thing. It can push us to live more intentionally, to value our time, to nurture the relationships that really matter.
Absolutely. It's about focusing on what's important, making each day count. and realizing that you're not alone in this, you know? We're all in this together. There are people you can talk to, resources to help you process all of it.
Well said. So, listener, if you're out there exploring these big questions about life and death, just remember, death is a part of life. It's going to happen, but it doesn't have to be something to be afraid of.
Embrace it. Live a life you're proud of. Leave behind a legacy that reflects who you are.
And if you're struggling with any of this, don't hesitate to reach out for help. Talking about death, even with all its complexities and unknowns, it can actually be a really powerful step towards living a more fulfilling life.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Oh, this has been quite the deep dive, lots to think about for sure. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep searching for answers.
And remember, death might be inevitable, but how you live your life is up to you.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. We'll see you next time.